Now we're going to take a look at an interesting social intervention created in our lab for math and science learning. Vanished was an alternate reality game created with the Smithsonian and was played online with middle school students as a one-time event.
Vanished was a mystery-solving game that ran as a live event. Created by the Education Arcade in collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution, it was inspired by alternate reality games, or ARGs. Over the course of 8 weeks, thousands of players had to work together to solve a scientific mystery. Players logged in and had to work together to follow a trail of clues, gather data, create and test hypotheses, solve puzzles, and collaborate with Smithsonian scientists to solve a scientific mystery. Eventually, players pieced together a narrative about a future where humankind met a grim fate due to a series of global climate events. Using the scientific thinking skills honed throughout the game, they were able to help avoid this disaster.
It evolved out of a genre of games called ARGs, or alternate reality games, which are sort of a collaborative, interactive narrative that unfolds over time. Sort of a mystery-solving game. They're often described as treasure hunts, but that's kind of a misnomer. Usually there's a very elaborate mystery that needs to be unraveled through a series of elaborate clues, puzzles, codes. These codes and activities are distributed both online and in the real world, so you might need to go, say, pick up an object in the real world and then go online to collaborate with people to crack that code, and that would unlock the next part of the story.
And like all alternate reality games, it never quite announced itself as a game. It acted as if it was real life. Basically, kids signed up in advance to play what was billed as the MIT Smithsonian Science Game. And on day one, when they logged in at the starting time, they got a video of some MIT students, a kind of scratchy video that was all kind of corrupted. But they were saying, something's gone wrong. We'd planned a game for you, and somebody hacked our server, and it went down, and we can't figure out what's going on. So we opened up a forum. Please go on the forum and help us solve the problem.
And there were snippets of encoded messages embedded in that video. There were 99 different messages, and so 99 different students, but in reality, many hundreds to thousands of students had to compile those messages, put them all together in one location, then decode them. Each snippet was encoded with a different code. Then take all of those snippets and sort of move them around like magnet poetry to try to decode the message. So it was an incredibly difficult process. But they did it with basically no help from us, the adult moderators. We threw that out there, and within 72 hours, these middle school age students had cracked a code that had stumped 2 different Ivy League PhDs that we'd shown it to.
Now, of course, that was the fiction of the game, but so that game was as if the players, all middle schoolers all over the country, were trying to solve the problem of what went wrong with the game, and that led to a series of scientific investigations, during which time they talked to Smithsonian scientists online, they visited museums and collected data, they did data collection in their own backyards, they did research online, they solved problems collectively through online forums. They played a bunch of smaller flash games that got at different science concepts, and they did all that sort of in the pursuit of sort of unfolding this series of interlocking mysteries.
One of the things that the Smithsonian really wants to do is reach out beyond their walls. It's the nation's museum, but the vast majority of Americans will actually never get to DC. So they wanted some of their educational outreach and some of their resources to be available to people who couldn't come there and experience the museum in person. And the Smithsonian gave us access to some of their scientific experts. Smithsonian isn't just a museum, it's a place where original scientific research takes place. We worked with a paleontologist. Rusty's more of a paleoclimatologist. He studies the ancient history of climate. We worked with a volcanologist, with a forensic anthropologist, somebody who determines how people lived and died by looking at their skeletal remains. A bee expert who talked a lot about bees, pollination, and climate. And we were looking at these 4 experts. We created a story arc about environmental science, and we created a science fiction story where in the far future, global warming had caused society to regress. And then that was followed up by a major climate event when there was an asteroid strike. And so then the students had to take this information that we had given them, little snippets and clues and archaeological digs and geological information, and assemble this story in reverse. And in the course of doing so, we had online video conferences where students could get to talk to these Smithsonian scientists, and the scientists would talk to them not in sort of a career day, like I'm a scientist and here's what I do and here's why it's important. They bought into the premise of the game, that they were all collaboratively solving a mystery together. And they treated the students like collaborators, like equals, and said, yeah, I'm here to help, what are your questions? And students would ask questions like, well, what can you tell from somebody's bones about how they lived and died? Well, said the forensic anthropologist might talk about how certain professions change your skeleton. If you're a seamstress and you hold needles in your teeth, you'll have notches in your teeth where the needles are. And she talked about how certain chronic conditions can leave their tail on your bones. We would give the students 3D scans of real skeletons, real skulls and real femurs from the Smithsonian collection, and have them extrapolate from that how those people lived and died. So it was really great to see students getting to actually collaborate with scientists, not be lectured to by them. And as a result, because they were treated like equals, that the students were treated like equals, they treated the scientists like rock stars. It was so cool to just see how excited they were. They would say, oh my gosh, an anthropologist, this is great. And someone said, I've never had anybody say, I'm so glad there's an anthropologist here.
From a design perspective, the goal of Vanished was to change kids' attitude toward science or being scientists, and to help them understand the ways in which science is like the kind of creative problem solving that they do in their best moments in their lives.
The thing that's really exciting about ARGs is that they encourage a large group of people to come together and tackle very difficult, ill-defined problems. And when we saw people tackling such ill-defined problems collaboratively online without a lot of sort of hand-holding or supervision, some folks in our lab thought, this looks a lot like the scientific process. Science isn't how, in the real world, is usually not how it is in the classroom. In the classroom, it's a lot like some video games. You're given a quest, complete this lab. And if you are supposed to say, try to distill hydrogen out of wood, and you fail to get hydrogen, you failed. You did it wrong, and therefore you are bad at the lab and bad at the science, and you get a bad grade. In science, that's usually not how things work. If you get an unexpected result, that means there was some kind of variable that you didn't account for, or there's some kind of new discovery that hasn't been made yet. Failure leads to future discovery. Unexpected results are interesting and part of the process. And so we wanted to create a game where if you got unexpected results, that was part of the process. It was part of kind of this evolving process of discovery, and we also wanted people to work with a large community of people, because we wanted people to share knowledge and share hypotheses and figure out ways to test them.
The point of Vanished was not to instruct kids in any particular field of science, although over the course of the game they engaged with geology and astronomy and forensic anthropology and archaeology, but that wasn't the point of the game. The point of the game was to help them understand that the kind of playful problem solving that they normally do while playing games is very close to what scientists do, and to change their sort of image of what science is and who scientists are, to move it from the notion of a priesthood of people with specialized knowledge that other people couldn't have access to rather people just like themselves who are trying to solve interesting questions. That really the work of science is the work of asking interesting questions. From a research perspective, I think because we were taking on this relatively new form of the alternate reality game, we were really trying to understand better the degree to which that particular mode might actually work to achieve the goals that we had for ourselves. Vanished was for middle schoolers, kids from age 11 to 14, and because of legal restrictions on the ways in which we could interact with kids online, we couldn't collect as much data about them as we might be able to collect about an older audience. We do know, based on zip codes, that the audience probably skewed a little bit more upper middle class than the general population, but not excessively so, and a little bit more male, but only 52% to 48%. So, and it didn't surprise us that this would be the case, that because it was billed initially as a MIT Smithsonian science game, and that we could mostly advertise it through newspapers and other forms of media, that we would skew a little bit up the socioeconomic ladder. We did see a huge range in terms of language skills, so some kids whose writing and reading wasn't very good nevertheless participated actively in the game. We don't think it was all one big homogeneous audience, but as I said, we only had limited data for that.
That said, we did hear from some teachers who incorporated it into their classroom with really great results. We heard from one teacher who works specifically with at-risk youth in Idaho.
In a city, in a school that was the middle school that caught all the kids who were flunking out or dropping out of the other schools in the district. So these were the hard luck cases.
And he, without really knowing that much about Vanished, because it had never been done before, brought it into his classroom kind of on a, it was kind of an edgy thing to do, but he found that it really helped students identify as scientists because of the difficulty and free-form nature of the problem. So this wasn't, while we did have a lot of students who were clearly could be filed under the gifted and talented umbrella, but we also had students who had been really struggling in traditional education who came to this and really self-identified as scientists and were very proud of their work and the challenges that they were able to complete.
But to me, the real kicker was when he said that he overheard 2 of his students saying that they wanted to be scientists when they grew up. And it seemed to me that it's only N of 1, and you can't necessarily extrapolate too much from an anecdote, but that certainly is what we want to see in the games we do. We assume that kids come to games with all kinds of talents and skills that they're not demonstrating in school, and that if we can activate those and help them recognize the connection between those talents and skills and interests and curiosities with academic achievement, that we could change their attitudes toward that. I would say at its very heart, Vanished was about collaborative learning. Every problem that got presented to the players was presented to them publicly as a group, and the only way that a player could contribute to the solution was by posting their response to other players. You had to sort of be a typical problem, and they were quite open-ended problems. Here's a typical problem in Vanished. In the course of the game, you're talking to people in the future, and the people in the future don't know what's happened between our time and their time, and that's what you're helping them figure out. And they tell you, after some amount of other investigations, it emerges that the future is colder than the present. So they say to you, what things might make the world colder? So what the player has to do is actually hypothesize what could make the world colder, but that isn't sufficient, because then the people in the future have also asked, what evidence should we look for to confirm your hypothesis? So kids, in effect, had to go online and talk to each other about what things might make the world colder and what data there would be, what evidence there would be in the future that would verify their hypothesis. Now, that was all done socially. It wasn't like you could fill out a form and just send it off. You had to actually do it in the group. You had to talk about it. It didn't mean that some kids didn't have insights that were sort of singular and that they brought them to the larger group, but they tended to get fortified and reaffirmed by the larger group.
We really wanted this to be a space just for young adolescents. So we made a rule that teachers and parents could certainly make an account and they could access the resources and they could watch other students play the game, but they could not actually try to solve any of the puzzles or post to the forums where a lot of the hypothesizing and problem solving was taking place.
So, with parents, it was the same as teachers. We had a handful of parents who were actively engaged with their kids' learning. They were enthusiastic about it. Probably these were parents who were doing that kind of thing before. I think, to me, the holy grail, by the way, in educational games would be games that help parents understand better what their kids' capabilities were. And I think we ought to be thinking more about games that can be played between parents and kids, with an eye toward how that might change parents' understanding.
One of the things I often hear is, well, you just created an online space, sort of free-form online space for middle schoolers. Isn't it a total disaster? I bet it's all chaos, and I bet there's a lot of name-calling and things like that. And the amazing thing is we did screen every post, but there was just about zero bullying. There was one person who was sort of getting on people's cases and being mean for being mean's sake. And people told that person, you know, we don't want you here. We're having a good time, and you're clearly trying to ruin people's good time. And you should, you know, if you want to act that way, go somewhere else. And out of over 6,700 youth participants, that is the only person we had to ban. I think you'd be hard pressed to find another online community where 1 out of nearly 7,000 people was the problem person.
As you heard, Vanished was an interesting experiment, bringing kids together to solve problems collaboratively in an online environment. I hope this has given you ideas and inspiration for how you might incorporate social learning into your projects. Keep in mind that collaborative learning technologies don't have to happen at massive scales in order to have an impact. The work students do with their neighbors in a computer lab can be just as meaningful as the work done in Vanished.